The wine arrives first, then the food. Roasted boar, honeyed dates, platters of oysters still glistening. Music, you're seated, 3 cushions from the Emperor of Rome. Your wife sits music beside you. Your daughter, barely 16, adjusts her staller nervously across the table. The room fills with senators, generals, their families. Everyone who matters in the empire is here. And then Caligula stands. He doesn't toast. He doesn't announce anything. He walks slowly around the table, past the consuls, past the prefects, past men who command legions. He stops behind your daughter. His hand rests on her shoulder. He says 5 words to you, not to her. The room doesn't gasp. No one moves, because everyone here has already learned what you're learning now. In this palace, objection is music, permission to die. So, you do what every father in this room has done. You smile. You nod. You watch her leave with him. And when she returns an hour later, silent, pale, adjusting her dress, you pour more wine and pretend you saw nothing because Rome just taught you. The empire doesn't care what you saw. It cares what you're willing to forget. If this is the history they don't teach in schools, the documented truth they hoped you'd never find, then subscribe now because we keep uncovering these stories one by one. No sugarcoating, just the raw truth. What happened in these rooms didn't make it into most history books, but the records exist. If you're here because silence, music, shouldn't erase documented history, then stay. We're going back inside. In 37 AD, when music, Caesar Augustus's grandson Caligula took power, Rome didn't crown a stranger. They crowned a legacy. His father, Germanicus, had been the most beloved general in Roman history. Crowds wept at his funeral. Riots broke out when whispers spread that Tiberius had him poisoned. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, descended directly from Augustus. She'd accompanied Germanicus on campaigns, standing beside soldiers in Germania while pregnant. Their children represented everything Rome told itself it still was: discipline, nobility, military tradition, divine ancestry. When Tiberius finally died, the music Senate didn't deliberate. They offered the purple to Gaius, nicknamed Caligula, little boots from the miniature legionary sandals he wore as a child among the troops. He was 24 years old. Rome erupted in music celebration. Political prisoners were released. Gladiatorial games were funded. Music, the granaries were opened. Taxes were reduced. Suetonius records that over 160,000 animals, music, were sacrificed in the first 3 months of celebration alone. For 7 months, it felt like the dark years under Tiberius were over. Then Caligula collapsed. In October 37 AD, the emperor fell into a fever so severe that priests' music were dispatched to every temple in the city. Senators pledged their lives to the gods if he survived. 1. Atanius, music. Secundus even vowed to fight as a gladiator if the emperor recovered. Philo of Alexandria records that the entire empire held music, its breath. Grain shipments stalled, markets closed, messengers rode day and night between Rome and the provinces, carrying updates. For days, he lingered between consciousness and death. And when he woke, the records fracture music here. Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Fellow, Seneca, all of them note the change, but none explain it. Some claim brain fever. Others suggested poisoning. Modern historians have speculated epilepsy, encephalitis, hypothyroidism. But diagnosis doesn't matter. What matters is the man who opened his eyes was not the one who closed them. Within weeks, he declared himself a living god and demanded temples in his image. He forced senators to run alongside his chariot for miles, music in their togas. He ordered a floating bridge built across the Bay of Baiae, over 2 miles long, just so he could ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate. The construction consumed ships needed for grain, music, transport. He revived the treason courts, the same courts that destroyed his family. And he began altering how the palace held music banquets. At first, Rome interpreted these as eccentricities, youthful excess, the arrogance of sudden power. But within months, the pattern clarified. Music, this wasn't instability. This was methodology. Banquets were not optional. Senators received word. The emperor requests your attendance. Bring your wife. Bring your daughters if they are of age. Refusal wasn't listed as an option because refusal didn't need to be forbidden. Everyone remembered what happened to families who disrespected Tiberius. So they came. The palace dining halls stretched over 300 feet. Couches lined the walls, arranged music by rank. Slaves moved between them with wine, fruit, delicacies imported from music, Egypt, and Gaul. Caligula reclined at the head, and he watched. Not the food, not the entertainment. He watched the women. Ancient sources, music, describe what became routine. He would study a senator's wife across the room openly while her husband sat 3 couches away. Sometimes he commented loudly, comparing her to others, critiquing her appearance, praising features in language meant to humiliate the man, not flatter the woman. Sometimes he gestured. Music, a servant approached. A quiet word. The woman stood because she had no choice and followed. The room continued eating. Conversation resumed. No one acknowledged what just happened, because acknowledging it meant choosing. Object, music, and vanish, or stay silent and survive. Rome chose survival every single time. In the end, it wasn't the knight's superior equipment or training that mattered. It was the terrain, the geography, and the will of the people who knew it best. By the end of the day, thousands of Habsburg soldiers lay dead, scattered in the snow, while 1,500 Swiss peasants stood victorious, their power now undeniable. This was going to be public, theatrical, humiliating, a demonstration of what happened when peasants forgot their place in the hierarchy that God himself had ordained. By autumn of 1315, Leopold had gathered thousands of music, knights, and cavalry from across Habsburg territories. Men who had trained for war since childhood. Men whose armor alone represented wealth most peasants would never see in their lifetimes. Men who understood that music, their entire social function, was crushing exactly this kind of resistance. Chroniclers who saw the army assembled described it as confident to the point of boredom. There was no expectation of actual resistance. These were farmers, herders, men who spent their days managing livestock and arguing about grazing rights. They would scatter at the sight of cavalry. They always did. History said so. The plan was straightforward. The kind of military operation that Habsburg commanders had executed dozens of times. March through, music, Morgarten Pass in overwhelming force. Crush any token resistance with minimal casualties. Occupy the canton. Music, install loyal administrators. Restore proper feudal order. Make sure everyone in the Alps understood that independence was temporary and obedience was permanent. What Leopold didn't understand, what he fundamentally couldn't understand, given everything his world had taught music, him since birth, was that the Swiss had stopped asking for permission. They weren't preparing petitions. They were preparing the mountain. Before we continue, hit subscribe if you want more history. They deliberately left out of your textbooks. What's about to happen in this pass is exactly why those in power prefer you never hear these stories. Morgarten Pass was not a battlefield. It was a geographic sentence waiting to be read aloud. Picture a narrow corridor barely wide enough for an army marching in column formation. On the eastern side, a steep forested slope, music, rising sharply, covered in loose rocks and avalanche debris, thick undergrowth, centuries of fallen timber. On the western side, Lake Igori, cold and deep even in summer. In mid-November, the surface had started to freeze, music in patches. Thin ice that could support nothing. Water beneath that would stop a heart in minutes. Between the slope and the lake, just enough room for horses, music armor, supply wagons, and the absolute certainty that peasants wouldn't dare attack professional soldiers here. That certainty was the trap. The Habsburg army entered the pass in dense formation. Knights rode in the center. Music, surrounded by lighter cavalry and infantry. Supply wagons followed, banners flew, armor gleamed, horses struggled slightly on icy ground, hooves slipping occasionally, but nothing that suggested danger. The march was slow, deliberate. The kind of pace an army adopts when it believes the war is already over, and the music, rest is just ceremony. Above them, completely hidden in the tree line, the peasants watched music and waited. They had been there for hours, perhaps days, positioning everything, music, perfectly. This wasn't ambush. This was engineering. They knew the army was coming. They knew the exact route. They knew precisely where the column would be most compressed, most unable to maneuver. They had gathered boulders over weeks, boulders the size of wine barrels, some larger, masses of stone that normally took teams of oxen to move. They positioned them along the slope at carefully calculated intervals, held in place, music, by wooden barriers and rope. They collected logs, thick timber from trees, music, that had stood for decades, heavy enough to crush bone and steel. These weren't siege weapons, just gravity, mass, and an understanding of music. What happens when you give physics a steep slope to work with? The Swiss didn't have cavalry. They didn't have plate armor, music, that cost annual incomes. They had the mountain. They had terrain they'd walked their entire lives. They had local knowledge worth more than steel. Music, and they had planned what happens when you give the mountain a push at exactly the right moment. Below, the Habsburg column continued forward, oblivious, confident, committed. The pass narrowed further. Horses bunched together. Space between riders disappeared. Retreat would now require the entire army to reverse course in a confined corridor while under attack. Nearly impossible. The Swiss let them get deeper, let the front of the column commit, let the rear get fully enclosed. Then they cut the ropes and removed the barriers, music, and released the mountain. The attack didn't announce itself. Catullus had selected a bride knowing what the palace required, and she, whether she understood or not, had been married into compliance. This wasn't rare. Marriage contracts from this period began including clauses, music, about imperial obligations. legal language that allowed annulment if a wife failed to fulfill duties to the state. Rome had begun writing submission into law. The Praetorian, music guards stood outside every banquet. They escorted the women to the emperor's chambers. They escorted music them back. They saw everything and they said nothing because their role wasn't protection. It was enforcement. The Praetorians weren't loyal to Rome. They were loyal to payment. Caligula doubled their salary immediately after taking power. Music. He gave them bonuses during festivals. He armed them with the best equipment in the empire, and in exchange, they upheld one rule. Whatever happens inside the palace stays inside the palace. But even financial loyalty has limits. By 40 AD, cracks formed. Cassius Chaerea, a decorated Praetorian tribune who had served under Germanicus, became a target of the emperor's mockery. Caligula questioned his manhood, music, publicly, gave him degrading passwords to repeat during guard rotations. He forced him to kiss his hand in exaggerated submission during ceremonies. Ancient music. Sources describe Chaerea as older, battle-hardened, respected among the ranks, and visibly humiliated. He didn't object, but he stopped smiling. Other Praetorians noticed. Cornelius Sabinus, another tribune, had watched senators humiliated for months. He'd escorted women who left the emperor's chambers weeping. He'd stood guard while their husbands, music, pretended not to notice. And he'd collected his salary. But the passwords were different because the passwords were directed at them. The Praetorians were being told, "You are no different than the senators. You endure because I allow it." By late 40 AD, multiple plots existed. Senators whispered in private villas. Freed men passed messages, but nothing moved because Caligula had built a system where individual resistance was suicide and collective action required trust. And trust required knowing who else would act. In a palace where informants were rewarded and silence was survival, no one knew. Chaerea's conspiracy succeeded not because it was brilliant. It succeeded because it was small. 3 men, maybe 4. No grand speeches, no Senate involvement, just exhaustion. They didn't plan for months. They didn't recruit allies. They waited for a music opportunity. January 24th, 41 AD, the Palatine Games. Thousands in attendance. Caligula left the theater through an underground corridor leading back to the palace. The German bodyguard, his personal unit of towering German soldiers, accompanied him. Partway music, they stopped because Chaerea told them to. He was their superior officer. They obeyed. Chaerea and Cornelius Sabinus intercepted Caligula in the narrow passage. The sources described chaos. The first blow came from behind. Chaerea's blade, music, struck between the shoulder and neck. Caligula fell. Then the others joined. 30 stab wounds, some to the chest, some to the groin, some to the face. They didn't stop until he was unrecognizable. The German bodyguards heard the commotion. They rushed back, but by then Caligula was dead. In the confusion that followed, someone, history doesn't agree, who reached Caligula's chambers. His wife, Caesonia, was killed. His infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, was killed. Her head smashed against a wall. Not as justice, as a ration. Because as long as Caligula's bloodline survived, someone might seek revenge. And no one wanted revenge. They wanted forgetfulness. When news reached the Senate, they didn't mourn. They debated whether to restore the Republic. For hours, arguments filled the chamber. Some senators, music, called for elections. Others proposed a council of consuls rotating power. It felt, for a moment, like possibility. But the Senate had no army. The Praetorian Guard did, and the Praetorians weren't interested in debate. They found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding behind a curtain in the palace. The man Rome had dismissed music as a fool for years, stammering, limping, ignored at family dinners. The Praetorians declared him emperor, not because they loved him, but because he promised to pay them. 15,000 sestertii per soldier, the largest donative in Roman history. At that point, the Senate voted to confirm Claudius the same day. The Republic was never mentioned again. Chaerea expected execution. He'd killed an emperor. He'd violated music, his oath as Praetorian, but Claudius hesitated. Chaerea was popular among the troops. Executing him risked mutiny. For weeks, Chaerea remained in custody, neither charged nor released. Then whispers started. If Chaerea wasn't punished, what message did that send? That killing emperors was acceptable. Claudius finally ordered the execution. Chaerea was beheaded. Cornelius Sabinus followed. The other conspirators, those whose names survived, were exiled or quietly removed from the record. Rome moved on. The records don't say what happened to the women. Livia Paulina survived. She remarried. Years later, Claudius's wife, Agrippina, accused her of witchcraft. She was exiled, then forced to commit suicide. Music, other women simply vanished from documentation. Daughters who attended the banquet stopped appearing in family genealogies. Wives mentioned in earlier inscriptions disappeared from later ones. Some historians suggest suicide. Music, Others suggest quiet exile. Some propose they were simply written out, removed from memory the way Rome removed Caligula's statues. Because Rome didn't want a reckoning. It wanted forgetfulness. Caligula's name was erased from monuments. His decrees were annulled. Claudius declared him, music, damnatio memoriae, condemned to oblivion, not to honor the victims, but to erase the question of complicity. If Caligula was insane, then Rome didn't fail. It was simply cursed with temporary madness. And madness, unlike cowardice, can't be blamed. The women who survived were given gifts, land, music, money, compensation for silence, and they took it. Because what choice remained? Their testimony would have required Rome to admit what it spent centuries pretending didn't matter. So they accepted the gold, remarried, and disappeared into history. Caligula ruled for 3 years and 10 months. In that time, he didn't invent imperial abuse. Tiberius had committed atrocities on Capri for a decade before him. Suetonius describes music, how Tiberius forced young boys and girls into sexual acts, sometimes throwing them off cliffs afterward. How he kept nobles imprisoned in his villa, torturing them while pretending they were honored guests. Augustus himself had exiled his own daughter Julia for adultery, though many believed it was political, music revenge disguised as morality. After Caligula, the pattern continued. Claudius, who Rome thought would restore order, was later accused of murdering his wife, Messalina, after she humiliated him publicly. Nero kicked his pregnant wife, Music Poppaea, to death, then married a boy named Sporus after having him castrated. He forced Sporus to dress as Poppaea and appear in public as his wife. He also hosted banquets, music, where senators' wives were assaulted while their husbands watched, calling it entertainment. Commodus fought as a gladiator and sold positions in the Senate to the highest bidder. Elagabalus forced Vestal virgins, priestesses sworn to chastity, into marriages, then divorced them weeks later. He paraded through Rome in women's clothing while assaulting senators' wives at state, music functions. Caracalla murdered his own brother Geta in their mother's arms, then ordered the deaths of 20,000 of Geta's supporters, including their families. The list continues for centuries. So the question isn't why Caligula, music, did what he did. The question is why Rome acted like it was temporary. After Caligula's death, music, the Senate debated restoring the Republic for 6 hours. Then they confirmed Claudius and went home because the Senate had lost its power decades earlier, not suddenly but gradually. Under Augustus, the Senate still appointed governors and music controlled finances. Under Tiberius, the Senate still debated laws. Under Caligula, the Senate attended banquets and clapped when told. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. Augustus had given the praetorians permanent status and a salary funded by the imperial treasury, not the Senate. Tiberius had moved treason trials from public courts to private imperial hearings. Caligula simply made explicit, music, what had been implicit. The Senate governed because the emperor allowed it, and that permission could be revoked. When Claudius took power, he didn't restore Senate authority. Music, he thanked them for their confirmation as if their vote had mattered. Then he governed exactly as Caligula had, minus the theatrical cruelty. The structure remained, only the performance changed music, and Rome called it reform. Suetonius, writing 70 years after Caligula's death, included the details about the banquets, but he framed them as examples of insanity. Proof that Caligula was uniquely deranged, not that the system allowed it. Cassius Dio, writing 150 years later, documented the wives who were summoned, but he wrote in Greek for an audience, music far from Rome. His accounts were histories, not accusations. Seneca, who lived through Caligula's reign, mentioned Lalia Paulina's emeralds, but didn't mention what she wore them for. The sources exist, but they exist as fragments, as anecdotes embedded in larger narratives about imperial excess. Never as investigations into why hundreds of men with wealth, power, music, and military command waited for someone else to act. Never as testimony from the women who survived. Because asking music, those questions would have required Rome to confront what it spent centuries denying, that the system had been designed to make resistance impossible. And that silence wasn't cowardice. It was architecture. We know Lalia Paulina's name because she remarried an emperor. We know Caesonia's name because she died, music, with Caligula. We know Julia Livilla, one of Caligula's sisters, because she was later exiled for alleged adultery. But the others, the daughters brought to banquets at 16, the wives summoned while their husbands watched, the women who attended month after month, year after year, knowing what attendance, music, meant, they remain nameless. Their names exist only as gaps. Inscriptions that mention wife of without listing her name, genealogies that skip a generation, marriage contracts, music that end abruptly. Some historians have tried to reconstruct these lives from financial records. A dowry paid, then music returned. A property transfer with no explanation. a will that disinherits a daughter for reasons known only to the family. But reconstruction isn't testimony. And without testimony, what remains is structure. The palace, the banquets, the system, and the men who built it. Caligula's assassination didn't save Rome. It taught Rome that spectacle could be tolerated as long as it eventually ended. Music, that humiliation could be endured as long as status remained. That women could be erased as long as lineage continued. The palace didn't close after Caligula. It remained the center of music power. The banquets continued under Claudius, Nero, and the emperors who followed. What changed wasn't the system. What changed was that Rome learned to call it music statecraft instead of madness. And the women who survived were never asked what they learned, because their testimony would have required Rome music to admit what it spent centuries pretending didn't matter. That the empire's power rested not on law or honor or military strength, but on who it taught to stay silent. And how the records exist. The sources are documented. The names are still there, or they're not. Both absences tell the same story. If history like this matters, stay with us. Crimson Historians doesn't let silence win.